We question our daily position, seeking answers and definitions. Get the queries off your chest with Ahkam SOS.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Ahkam SOS, the show that discusses Islamic duties and practices. MashaAllah, we're here on a Wednesday night for another live show, taking in all your questions. And if you have a question you'd like to ask us, why not text us via the WhatsApp, or you could give us the email, send an email. It is ahkamsos@imamhussein3.tv. Or alternatively, give us a call live in the studio, and inshallah, me and the Sheikh will be able to discuss your question. I'm your host, Mohsin Shah, and joining me is Sheikh Ali Ma'a. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhna.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
How are you this evening?
Alhamdulillah.
MashaAllah. Sheikhna, over the last couple of episodes, it being the Hajj, we've been discussing all the ahkam in regards to Hajj. Inshallah, let's continue our discussion. And then my first question is that when it comes to sheltering and covering, being underneath a shelter, or your head being covered with the shelter, is it acceptable between, sunset and sunrise, or is it sunset till Fajr time that you can travel under a shelter, or is it only from daytime and nighttime you're not allowed?
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. It is not permissible for the muhrim, the one who made the intention and the niyyah to wear the ihram, to actually shelter under, for example, a chamber or a small room which is placed on the in the old days, for example, it used to be on the camels.
Okay.
Small chambers.
Oh, like a carriage.
Exactly, like a carriage, exactly. Yeah. Or for example, moving vehicles, cars, trains, and so forth. He's not allowed to actually shelter. Mm-hmm. So they need to sit on the top roof of the car or the bus to avoid the kafara. Of course, if you sit, you have to pay the kafara. If you sit inside,
okay,
you need to pay the kafara, which is a whole sheep, basically, for that purpose. So it's got nothing to do with during the night or the day.
Okay.
It's absolutely not permissible to shelter.
I see, and this is when traveling. So
yes,
whether you're traveling in the
yes.
daytime or nighttime,
exactly,
have to stay covered. Sheikhna, the wife of someone who has done a Hajji or a Hajj, the pilgrim, does she become haram to him if this person hasn't done Tawaf al-Nisa but was out of ignorance? Is she haram on him? Is the marriage nullified also?
In the case of not performing the Tawaf al-Nisa, and Tawaf al-Nisa is, I think this is the last Tawaf you do before you leave the A'mal of Mecca. Of course, women will be forbidden if you haven't done Tawaf al-Nisa. You cannot approach the wife at all until your rep, your wakil, your na'ib, he goes and he performs the Tawaf al-Nisa if you're away from the country, or you do it yourself, you go back and you do it yourself. So either way it should be done. It's wajib.
Sheikh, when we wear the ihram, it's very, very important that we remain tahir. And, many things can happen during, the different rituals. One of them is obviously bleeding, and it happened to one of my friends as well. He cut himself. So if you cut your finger, let's say you're doing tawaf and, it brushed against something, or, someone, threw a stone, or something, it got cut, it's bleeding. What is one to do? It's very, very difficult, isn't it, to go to the nearest toilet and then to clean it and to make it tahir and so forth, considering the distance and all the crowd and everything. So, what is the ruling in this case?
You see, with regard to the ahkam of the ihram, as mentioned, there were prohibitions. I think I mentioned a couple of episodes ago about what are you allowed to do and you're not allowed to do. in overall, you have to abide with the ahkam of the ihram when you're in this state of ihram. And one of them is to be clean from any najasa. So it is wajib, mandatory for this individual to purify himself or herself from the blood on their body, on their ihram, so they can commence or resume the act of the tawaf. And there are, of course, details about where you can stop and go and do your, for example, to do your tathir and come back and then resume the act of tawaf. So if you're in the middle of the tawaf, let's say 3.5 of the tawaf you've done, 3 tawaf and a half, for example, what you do. If you're at the end, you have to, and so forth. There's a bit of details about where you can stop. Otherwise, you have to start anew again.
Okay.
If you're not in that correct position and number. So it really depends.
I see. Sheikh, another thing with the ihram and the conditions of wearing the ihram is that you're not allowed to wear any perfume at all, attar. And you and I both know that the Kaaba, mashallah, the black cloth on it is drenched in attar and it's drenched in perfumes. Now, if I'm doing the tawaf and the crowd push me onto the Kaaba and I touch it, is there any objection in this? Have I, invalidated the state of ihram?
No, there is no objection to that. That's fine. Just important that you have to consider is to go back to the same position you were left. Because sometimes you're pushed towards the Kaaba. You came out of your position in tawaf, so you have to go back and resume your tawaf again from that position in which you were, for example, kicked or pushed.
I see. Shaykhna, when we go to Mina, that's where majority of the qurbani is done. Is one of the conditions of the qurbani that the person performing the slaughtering has to be an Imami Shi'i, or is it okay for a Sunni to do it?
Like as we are back home and we actually buy our meat and chicken from the majority of the slaughtering houses are run by the non-Shia, by the Sunni slaughtering houses in overall. So we actually eat from their meat, so that's fine. As long as they do the Shahadatain, Muslims, that's fine. Even in Mina, if you want to sacrifice, that's fine. You can actually ask a non-Shia butcher, for example, to slaughter your udhiyah. That's fine.
I see. Sheikh, as you know, we do get emails in, and I have an email here, and it says, is it allowed for women to stone the greater Jamara herself, or to do it so by proxy? Because in doing so, she would come into physical contact with the non-mahram due to severe overcrowding, which is considered objectionable by some.
You see, there's a special ahkam for women in Hajj, particularly when it comes to the stoning. She can either join the crowd, that's fine, and do the stoning herself, or if it's too crowded, she fears of her, let's say, situation being there with majority, let's say men, for example. She can use a proxy, she can use a na'ib to go and do the rami, or some ulama would allow, if not the majority, would allow that you go a night before the Eid. So from Arafah, you go towards Mina and you do the rami there a night before Arafah. A night before the Eid.
Yes.
So you finish Arafah, you take, let's say you're the group leader, you take the woman with the bus straight towards Mina.
Yes.
It's almost empty. You only see, almost women there.
Yeah.
Do the rami at night, and then they can go back. Basically, they are allowed to actually do the rami the night before the Eid, and not on the Eid day. So they have the choice.
I see. Excellent. Sheikh, another question here from the email. Is it permissible to perform the sa'i between Safa and Marwa through the common route or through the upper one during the times of severe overcrowding in a bid to lessen the pressure upon the Muslims?
Well, it's better to do it on the ground, on the actual sa'i area, if there's no congestion or disturbing others and so forth. But you're allowed when it's really crowded, overcrowded. You can go up, first, second, third level of the sa'i and actually do the sa'i. Again, depends on your marja if he allows you to actually do the sa'i on other levels.
What if one, fails to perform the rami? Then, is his hajj invalidated? His Eminence, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he discusses this matter. What is his fatwa on the situation?
He would mention that if you fail to perform the rami, it doesn't invalidate your hajj. That's not going to actually ruin your hajj, because as I've mentioned, the main part of the hajj is Arafah. To be in Arafah is actually the grand hajj, or al-hajj al-akbar, as mentioned in the Holy Quran. So Arafah is very important to be there present. But for the rami, it doesn't really ruin your hajj, and even if it was deliberate, according to Ayatollah Sistani, that if you deliberately leave the rami, you're scared of the situation, you don't want to get into the crowd and do the rami, and you left the rami, that's not going to ruin your hajj, but it becomes a wajib, obligatory, to perform the qada in person, or you send somebody else as a matter of precaution, to send somebody as a wakil, as mentioned, on behalf of you, to go and actually do the rami instead.
Inshallah. Shaykh, I've got a question here from the WhatsApp, and it is it permissible for women and those with special needs and accompanied by others to assist to perform the act of the Eid day a night before by going to Mina after leaving Arafah land to stone the Jamara, then trim their hair and go to Mecca to do the tawaf and sa'i on the eve of Eid al-Adha and delay the sacrifice till next day?
I've just mentioned one or two questions before this question, that there's exception for women, and to add another two categories, those with special needs, disability and so forth, men or women, and assistant, the one who assists those, the one who guides them, for example, the group leader, for example, the guide, for example. He's allowed to be with them, the assistant. To go straight after Arafah day, in the evening, they go straight to Mina, although they have to go instead to Muzdalifah first, spend the night there, and then in the morning they have to go. But there's an exception for those three categories, that they go after the day of Arafah to Mina to do rami, and then go back to the holy city of Mecca and Masjid al-Haram in the Kaaba to perform the two acts which should be done on the day of Eid and onwards, the two tawafs with their salah, with the sa'i and so forth. And basically they don't have to wait for the sacrifice in order to do these a'mal, so they can actually do them all on that evening of the Eid Eve, on the the day of Arafah, but in the night time. So Laylat al-Eid. They do all these a'mal because of the exemption that was given to them. And of course the sacrifice will come afterwards on the day of Eid.
Channel, we're going to go to a short break, inshallah. Join us after the break as we'll discuss more on this topic and also take in more of your questions. Join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Ahkam SOS, the show that discusses Islamic duties and practices. If you have a question you would like to ask us, please send it in via the WhatsApp, the email address, or alternatively give us a call here in the studio and we'll be more than happy to discuss any of your questions. MashaAllah, we've got loads of questions coming in. But before we continue, Assalamu alaikum, Shaykhna.
Assalamu alaikum.
The question I have is that, is there a difference between the Ahkam of Hajj when it comes to, the Jafri school of thought and those of, different schools? Do we perform the same Hajj, or are the rituals a little different?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me bring up a hadith or a dialogue between one of the non-Shia leaders, and with one of our great leaders, Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. And you can see how different is in some of the ahkam between us and them.
Okay.
And where do they take the ahkam from, what source,
Yes.
and from what source we get the ahkam. This was actually in the time of the Abbasi so-called caliphs or rulers.
Okay.
And the question was asked by a man with the name of Abu Yusuf al-Qadi. He was a judge, and he seems to be the senior judge in the Abbasi time. He asks Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam about one of the Shar'i rule or ahkam in Hajj. He says, يا أبا الحسن ما تقول في المحرم أيستظل على المحمل. He says, oh Abu al-Hasan, Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, what do you say about a muhrim who takes shelter while he is on the, let's say, camel, on that carriage of the camel, or the chamber of the camel?
Mm-hmm.
Is he allowed while moving, on a moving, let's say, vehicle, is he allowed to take shelter? فقال عليه السلام, the Imam said, لا, no, he's not allowed. While he is on a moving vehicle, on the camel, on the horse, for example, to take shelter, he's not allowed. قال, Abu Yusuf again, he asks the Imam عليه السلام, and he says, فيستظل في الخباء. Is he allowed to take shelter inside the tent? In other words, fixed places, fixed accommodations, and so forth. فقال عليه السلام نعم. The Imam said yes. فعاد عليه القول شبه المستهزئ يضحك فقال. So he repeated the question of Abu Yusuf al-Qadi, but in a mockery state.
Okay.
Mocking.
Sarcastic?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
فقال يا أبا الحسن فما فرق بين هذا وهذا. What's the difference between this and this? What's the difference? He's taking shelter in a tent, halal.
Yeah.
On the camel, or let's say inside the car, it's haram. What's this?
Okay.
They're both shelters.
I see.
But see how ahkam that we get from is from the sources of Allah Azza wa Jal and the Holy Quran and Hadith of Ahlul Bayt and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. The Imam said, يا أبا يوسف إن الدين ليس بقياس كقياسكم. O Abu Yusuf, religion and faith is not taken by measurements or comparisons. You're comparing two things. Each has its own hukum.
Yes.
You can't just compare because you're allowed to shelter in the tent, خلاص halal, to shelter on moving vehicle, خلاص. The problem with the Imam says salamu alayhi, as your qiyas, as your measurement or comparisons, because they have in their madhab qiyas is allowed.
Okay.
In other words, as I've said, as an example, if something is
it's a ruling for one, and then they use that.
They use it for the others.
The
as an example, red wine is red and it's made of grapes.
Yes.
And you see a red juice as well.
Yeah.
Red grape juice. Because it's red and grape juice, you say it's haram. You're comparing them and you're measuring them and you give fatwa according to this. This is not allowed in the Shia school at all, because that's batil. We have to go back to the sources, to the kitab, the holy book, and the itra, the Prophet's household. Salamun alayhim ajma'een. Then the Imam says to Abu Yusuf al-Qadi, أنتم تلعبون بالدين. You are playing with religion. In other words, the Imam says to them, you are playing with religion. Because the problem is, since 14th century, how much ahkam has been changed.
Yes.
When they left Ahlul Bayt and the statement of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said, I leave two weighty things, the book of Allah and my progeny. It is in the Sahih, in Sahih Muslim, other Sahih mentions Ahlul Bayt.
Yes.
It's all there. But they neglected, ignored Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and favored somebody else and others over Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and that's why things changed, everything, even the Salah changed.
Yeah.
So the Imam says, you are playing with religion. Then the Imam says, إِنَّا صَنَعْنَا كَمَا صَنَعَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ. We did how the Prophet did. We followed the Prophet's footsteps in these ahkam of Hajj, for example. وَقُلْنَا كَمَا قَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ. And we said, as the Prophet said, we follow him. Ahlul Bayt follow Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وآله. Then he says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله يركب راحلته فلا يستظل عليها. That he used to be, of course, in ihram, Rasulullah, and he rides upon his, let's say, camel, and he wouldn't shelter. He wouldn't go inside the carriage. It was without carriage when he was in ihram. So we follow Rasulullah. If you want to follow some other ulama or scholars, it's up to you. We follow in this hukum Rasulullah. You want to shelter while you're moving in a vehicle, fine, it's up to you. Follow your alim. But we follow Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَتُؤْذِيهِ الشَّمْسِ. But while the sun used to harm the Prophet, the scorching sunshine in Arabia, as you know. So he used to cover himself with his own hands or his own body. فَيَسْتَتِرُ جسده بعضه ببعض, as I've said, he covers himself with his body. وربما ستر وجهه بيده, and sometimes he would cover his face with his hand on the scorching sun. وإذا نزل استظل بالخباء. When he dismounts the camel, he goes inside the tent. So we follow him. When he goes inside the tent, it's halal to shelter inside a fixed place or fixed accommodation, for example, inside the tent. He would shelter there from the sun. And in overall. وفي البيت وفي الجدار, and he would go inside, the وفي البيت وفي الجدار, and even he would use the shade, the shades basically of the house and the walls. So we in overall follow Rasulullah Sunnah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. But if you want to follow other sunnahs, they're available. The Shafi'i Sunnah, the Hanafi Sunnah, that's fine. You can follow their ahkam. But we follow Rasulullah Sunnah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. That's very important. That's what differentiates us and them. That we follow Rasulullah and his progeny as he advised us. Kitab Allah wa itrati ahli bayti. But if you want to follow others, it's up to you. It's your choice.
Ahsan, thank you very much, Sheikh. That was excellent. Moving on with our discussion, Sheikh, when it comes to the first Hajj, is it okay, first obligatory Hajj, must I shave my hair off, or is it okay just to trim the hair a little bit? Now, Sayyid Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani, Hafadullah, he has a fatwa on this. What does he say in his fatwa?
He would mention that as an obligatory precaution, احتياط وجوبي أو لزومي, that the choice of shaving should be there. So he needs to shave basically. As your first Hajj al-Islam, your first ever Hajj, you have to shave. Okay.
And when it comes to shaving, I've seen some people use machines to shave off their hair. I've seen some people use a cutthroat blade, like a razor or a blade to shave off their hair. Which is preferable?
It is sufficient to use these machines, but make sure that they are, they have a thin end of the tooth. So, to actually, when you shave your head, make sure it's the tooth are very thin in terms of shaving. So that's
close tooth. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sheikh, a question from the WhatsApp, and that is, if someone gives this sum of money to a trader, not a loan, but to be taken on one's behalf in another country for less than what we gave, is this type of transaction allowed?
You can call this as money transfer.
Okay.
You're allowed to transfer money from one country to another by taking the difference as your commission. It's your right to actually charge people. You're charging people for transferring their money from one country to another.
So it's like for the service.
So exactly for the service, exactly, yeah. So there's no objection to that. They can actually charge.
Sheikh, I've got a question from the WhatsApp. It's a really good one actually. Assalamu alaikum. Good show. A question in regards to interest. Which type of interests are allowed in Sharia? It's actually quite a good question, that, because according to the Quran, you're not allowed any interest whatsoever.
Of course, interest or riba or usury is not allowed at all. I think in the Quran, as far as I remember, there's a ayah which says فَأَذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ, and there's a ordering for the war for those who charging riba to this extent. It's so haram, it's so forbidden for the one to take or give interest. There are exemptions, of course, with this regard. One of them is that it is allowed for example, the father taking from his offspring's interest. That's allowed. Or let's say the offspring from their father, they charge the father the interest, or the husband from the wife, or the wife from the husband. These are exemptions. Exemptions. And of course, when it comes to as well, let's say the banks, major banks, worldwide banks, for example, non-Muslim banks, again, you're receiving interest. Ulama have ahkam with this regard. I think we spoke about it, that you are allowed to receive interests from, let's say, non-Muslim banks. You're allowed. But in overall, there are in details, inshallah, we'll try to mention some of these ahkam.
Inshallah, we'll have another discussion on Islamic economics and Islamic finances, inshallah. Sheikha, could you mention 2 makruh acts when it comes to the process of trading?
Initially, one of the first makruh, that to interfere in someone else's business and transaction. So there are, let's say, 2 parties, they're sitting on the table, they're making a deal, and you interfere. You try to buy the product from one of the sides. So don't interfere. Let them buy and sell between each other. Don't be in the middle of their business. So that's makruh. The second makruh is to actually trade or make transactions during the bayn al-tulu'ain, which is between the fajr time and the sunrise. This time is specifically for worship. The ibadah, salah, worship, dua, Quran recitation, and so forth. It's not the time for buying and selling. After the sunrise, inshallah, you can move towards your business day as usual. And
open the shop.
Inshallah.
Ahsan. Sheikhna, if there is, if one believes that there is a probability of harm, but obviously it's just common perception, there's no actually 100% guarantee that there's going to be harm, can one use tayammum to do wudu instead of water?
Yes, if the one feels there's a great possibility of harm, then of course the one can resort to tayammum. Tayammum is instead of wudu. And we mentioned previously that one of the categories or the criteria to use the tayammum instead of wudu is when you have water, you have everything there, but because of harm, because of, let's say, bodily harm, because of, let's say, there are, for example, beasts on a nearby river. Let's say you've been outside holiday near a river, for example. There's a bear, for example, and so forth. Then you can resort to the tayammum if there's a great harm expecting.
I see. Sheikh, I've got a question in from the WhatsApp. Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to ask, is it permissible for a boy of 15 years to have a girlfriend? I am a muqallid of Sayyid Sistani. So according to Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani, hafidhullah, 15-year-old boy, is he allowed to have a girlfriend?
The Sayyid clearly mentions that friendship with non-mahram is not allowed. You cannot have such a friendship.
Or a relationship in that fact.
Exactly. Allah Azza wa Jal have allowed us to have this in a halal format and method. Although they call this 15 years old as a child, in other words, he cannot marry. But I mean, at the end of the day, he's going to commit a sin. So it's difficult, to be honest, with to apply the Islamic rules and ahkam with the let's say Western rules and legislations. So would we allow this 15 years old to commit haram? or let him be in, if he's, of course, if he's, like, let's say, baligh in this age, would you allow him to actually commit a haram, or he does it in a halal way, let's say in a marriage contract way, in which allows him to do this act? But again, you're clashing with the Western rules and legislations. 16 and over, with the permission of the parents, you can get married. So it's really difficult.
Indeed. My father always used to say, if you're old enough to have a girlfriend, you're old enough to get married. So there you go. Shaykhna, another question in from the WhatsApp, that is in regards to segregation and segregated gatherings. Is it permissible for women to dance in front of women and also men to dance in front of men in a gender-wise segregated gathering? So the men are totally separate from the women. Normally we have this at weddings and so forth. Is it okay for the women to dance in front of the women and the men to dance in front of men?
Ayatollah Sistani clearly mentions that as a matter of obligatory precaution, احتياط لزومي أو وجوبي, that men are not allowed to dance in front of the men, and likewise the women are not allowed to dance in front of women. It's problematic, in other words, he would mention. So as a احتياط وجوبي, you have to avoid it. And this means that you can actually go back to a marja' who would allow it, because the Sayyid is giving precaution, احتياط. If he allows it, of course, in this mas'ala, you can go back to a marja', other marja' who allows it.
Okay.
And I haven't really seen somebody of the ulama who would allow it, but maybe you might find one or two, if they're, of course, a'lam, in other words, if they're more knowledgeable. So better for the one to avoid it.
Inshallah. Inshallah. Final question, Shaykhna, for this evening from the WhatsApp, and that is that we wear black scarves and black coats during Muharram. Wanted to ask that, is it allowed to wear it throughout the year? So the other months that are not Muharram, are we allowed to wear the black coat and scarf according to Ayatollah Sistani? Is this not makruh? So wearing the black, I'm assuming she says coat and scarf, so it may be a chador or something like that. But to wear black, you and I both know that it's makruh to wear too much black. But unless it's a istishhad or it's Muharram or if it's a grieving event, you are allowed to wear black. But black is not really considered a color to be wearing. But for the ladies, for the sisters out there, black scarves and black coats.
The Sayyid mentions that there's no problem in it, and it is not makruh to wear black all around the year. But there is actually a discussion between the ulama and the books of fiqh about the black, because when you're wearing black, basically, is it the sign of some, tyrants, for example, they used to wear black?
The Umayyads.
Or the pharaohs, for example. So would that becomes a makruh to wear? There's a discussion about it, but it seems to be that our ulama today, most of them or many of them, would not consider as makruh. So you can wear all. But I would rather allow. I mean, for the sisters, of course, it would be more in terms of modesty. It doesn't because if the sisters were very light, it would attract them somehow.
Yes.
Imagine the sister wears red scarf and white abaya, for example. That in overall attracts them somehow. Yes. So black would be more
suitable
and modest, exactly, for the sisters.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you very much, Shaykhna, and thank you to all the viewers for joining us, and thank you for sending in all your questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask, send it to us via the WhatsApp at the email address Ahkam SOS at imamhussein3.tv, or alternatively give us a call and you can be live on the studio, and inshallah me and the Shaykh will be able to discuss your question. We are back inshallah on Monday 6:30 here at Imam Hussein TV. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
We question our daily position, seeking answers and definitions. Get the queries off your chest with Ahkam SOS.